You're listening to Watchman Internet Radio. It's Monday and back to work. So let's get with it. Well, like I say, it's back to work, for me anyway. I took a week off, actually about 10 days. You know, I don't always do a daily show, but it's kind of a goal for me, right? Anyway, hope you're doing well. What are we going to talk about today? Well, the daily text, no. You can read it if you're interested. But I've got a question here from a listener. Actually, he writes a couple of questions. He asks simply, has the first resurrection started yet? And I believe that the reason that question is in the air is because the Watchtower has recently commented upon that. And of course, they claim that the first resurrection has been underway for about 100 years since Christ supposedly came in 1914. So the real question is not has the resurrection begun, but has Christ returned? Has the kingdom come to power? Has Christ's presence begun? Has the conclusion of the system begun? And the answer to that is no. Of course, Jehovah's Witnesses have to believe that it has begun because that's what the Watchtower says, and to disagree with the Watchtower is considered apostasy. And if you don't think that to be true, just tell your elders that you don't believe Christ returned in 1914. I think you know the outcome of that. You know, there are so many delusions. The world is just filled with lies on every level. And of course, that is because the world is ruled over by the father of the lie, Satan the devil. And he is a master at making something false appear to be true. And Jehovah's Witnesses think they're immune to that somehow because they're in the truth. But the Apostle Paul warned that God would allow a deluding influence to go to them, that they may get to believing the lie. And why? Because they did not take pleasure in the truth. So in other words, those who are under this delusion are also in the truth to an extent. And just like God tested the Israelites, after they came out of Egypt, they saw God's miracles. They knew he was powerfully with them. And yet, somehow, the majority of them couldn't seem to muster the necessary faith. And God allowed tests to come upon them to test their fidelity to him. And unfortunately, many of them failed to pass the test. So it shouldn't seem out of the ordinary that God allows for a deluding influence. Satan, really, it's an operation of Satan, this master liar, and he's convinced Jehovah's Witnesses that Christ has come. The second coming has already occurred. Actually, the Watchtower doesn't use that term, the second coming, except only in reference to, Christendom's reference to the second coming. But if you do a little research, you will find that the Watchtower is on record as saying that the second coming took place in 1914. Someone the other day asked me a similar question. He was studying or is studying with Jehovah's Witnesses, but he doesn't really believe that Christ came in 1914. And so he asked me for a scripture to prove to the people studying with him that Christ did not come in 1914. And I have to say, there is no scripture. And the reason for that is because, it's like, are there any scriptures that prove that pink unicorns do not exist? Right? But the way you disprove 1914 is by reasoning with Jehovah's Witnesses. And of course, most of them are not open to such reasoning. But the very verse that the Watchtower uses, you have to appreciate that the entire 1914 doctrine rests largely upon this chronology taken from Daniel regarding the 7 times. And we all know how that little algebraic formula works from 607, blah, 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 to 1914. And that's it. It is written in stone, etched as if the 10 Commandments in stone tablets. There is no other way that this could possibly be interpreted except the way it's explained and has been explained going back before 1914. It is interesting that the Watchtower showed a predisposition to announce that Christ has already come way before 1914. Back when Russell and the Allegheny Bible students first convened, they were interested in hammering out the basic doctrinal truths found in the Bible. And that was a very important work because obviously Satan's main instrument for deceiving mankind has been Christendom. Originally, the Catholic Church, and others have split off, the Orthodox, and then the Reformation, Lutherans, and dozens and dozens and dozens of so-called Protestant sects and denominations. And they all basically teach the same lies. And so these Bible students wanted to find out what the Bible really says. And that was a very, very valuable endeavor with far-reaching consequences for us. So we appreciate that God is not some mysterious Trinity. We know that Jesus was God's firstborn son. We know that we don't have a soul that survives the death of the person. We know that there's no such place as a burning hell, that it's merely the grave. Jesus was in hell for 3 days and so on. And we know that God is going to bring the dead back to life, for the most part, here on earth. And so these are very valuable truths. But at the time that these Bible students were just coming out of the darkness imposed upon them by the churches in which they were all immersed, from the very first, they believed that Jesus Christ had already returned and that his presence had begun, beginning in 1874. And they believed that the kingdom came to power in 1878. So that shows that they had a predisposition to believing that the kingdom has already come. At no time has the Watchtower ever taught that there is a future presence of Christ. They've always taught that Christ was present. So that is the predisposition. But getting back to that point, if we reason with Jehovah's Witnesses about this 7 times, it's not so much it seems brilliant on the surface that, you extrapolate 1,260 days, double that, and day for year and all that. And supposedly the appointed times of the nations ended in 1914. But if you can get a person to reason, and Jesus only mentioned this appointed times of the nations or times of the Gentiles, as it says in the Old King James, that's in the 21st chapter of Luke. And Jesus was speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then that's the sign to flee. And Jesus went on to say, these are times for meting out judgment and punishment, and Jerusalem will be trampled upon by the nations until the appointed times of the nations have been fulfilled. Well, we know 2 things. We know that the physical city of Jerusalem was indeed destroyed. The Romans acted as a disgusting thing when they came in 66 CE and went into the temple, undermined part of its wall, and then mysteriously withdrew, giving the Christians and Jews, if they were inclined, time to leave the city. And then the Romans, just as mysteriously, returned and razed the city to the ground. It killed 1 million Jews, and the survivors were hauled off in captivity. But we know that there is an antitypical Jerusalem that will be desolated during the conclusion as part of a great tribulation, the likes of which the world has never seen or will ever see again. So did this trampling of Jerusalem begin when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem 5 centuries before Jesus came? What person in their right senses would believe that? Well, unfortunately, millions and millions of Jehovah's Witnesses do. But do we, in our wildest imagination, believe that the apostles believed that Jesus was speaking about the previous destruction of Jerusalem? It's inconceivable that they would have been so dim. Keep in mind that in Jesus' last sojourn to Jerusalem, he looked over the city and he wept. And he told them that if only you had discerned the time of your being inspected. And he said, the days will come upon you when this temple will be thrown down, your children will be dashed. He was talking about the future destruction of that temple. And that is why, if just a few days later, his apostles had him off to themselves. They were up on the Mount of Olives, and they asked him, tell us, when will these things be? They wanted to know when the temple was going to be destroyed. And so Jesus was telling them, hey, look, it's already been destroyed. Babylonians destroyed it. That's when the nations began trampling. Right? It would have made no sense. That is exactly, though, what the Watchtower teaches. That this trampling that Jesus was foretelling as a future event had already taken place when Jesus was foretelling it. See the delusion? If something is so clearly unbiblical, and yet we believe it anyway, is that not evidence of a powerful delusion at work? Just like a Trinitarian. They read a passage that's, I am. There it is. I am. I'm God. I believe it. Jesus said it. And you could take a sledgehammer and you could never dislodge that from a Trinitarian's mind. Well, 1914 is the same with Jehovah's Witnesses. No amount of reasoning can dislodge it from their minds because the slave said it. And Jehovah provided this slave for us, and everything this faithful slave says is from the mouth of God and must be believed. Even though the apostle who was on the Mount of Olives, the apostle John said, "Do not believe every inspired expression, but test it to see if it really does come from God." So we just did that. The little demonstration I gave, we were testing the Watchtower's seemingly inspired expression. Do these appointed times of the Gentiles to trample Jerusalem, do they apply in the way that the Watchtower teaches? That Jerusalem began to be trampled upon when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem in 607 or whenever. I know that's a controversial date, but that's beside the point, isn't it? 587, whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the appointed times of the nations didn't begin then. The 7 times could not have possibly applied to the appointed times about which Jesus spoke. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses will retort and say, well, look, all the things that happened, World War I, the Spanish influenza, that's true. But are you saying that there cannot be another war somewhat more on a larger scale than the First World War? Well, there certainly was. It was called World War II. Are we saying there cannot be a third world war? Do you have any idea what's happening in the world? I mean, we know it's fake news, but some of it's getting through. The nations are building up towards a confrontation. The United States has declared China to be the enemy. It must be confronted. Stop their expansion from, building railroads and high-speed rail lines across Asia. And now they're wanting to develop Africa and get it out from underneath the heel of the British colonialist. Are we saying there can't be another world war? That's what the Watchtower says. How sensible is that? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses will say, well, look at the preaching work. Jesus said the good news of this kingdom will be preached in the entire inhabited earth, and then the end will come. And that's sealed that nobody's doing the preaching work of Jehovah's Witnesses on a scale as sponsored by the Watchtower. And that is true. It is absolutely true. But let's, again, reason. Jesus' disciples in the first century performed a similar preaching work. The Apostle Paul said that the good news had been preached to the entire inhabited earth. Of course, it hadn't. There's no indication that Christians went to China or India or to the Americas. So that's the pattern that we have. In the same breath that Jesus told his disciples to go preach and teach and make disciples and teach them all the things that he had commanded them, he said that I'm with you all the days until the conclusion of the system of things. Until. So Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the conclusion of the system of things began in 1914. So Jesus is saying, I'll be with you all the days from the time of his death, his resurrection. He's overseeing his faithful disciples all that era, 2,000 years, up until the conclusion. What happens during the conclusion? According to Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus is with them in another way, invisibly present. Well, wasn't Jesus invisibly present with his disciples all the days up until 1914? What changed from 1913 to 1914? Nothing really. We can cite a war. Yeah, the war began, sure. Was there any apparent change in the relationship of the Bible students with Christ? There's no apparent change there. So why did Jesus say that I'll be with you all the days until the conclusion? Does he leave them during the conclusion? Well, actually, yes, momentarily. And then he's with them in a very special way. He reveals himself. There's no such thing as an invisible presence. As I've spoken and written about, the presence is the same as the manifestation and the revelation. So that's why Jesus said he would be with them until the conclusion, because during the conclusion, it's a whole different deal. And the good news of the kingdom will not be preached during the conclusion. So the good news is preached, and then the end will come, not the end of the world, the end of the preaching, the end basically of Christianity. Because Christianity is characterized by the preaching and teaching and disciple-making work. And that will come to an end. And what happens then? During the conclusion is the judgment phase. Jesus said he will send forth his angels, and they will collect out from his kingdom all those things that cause stumbling and persons who are practicing lawlessness. So that occurs over a relatively short period of time. And God's people are put through a hardship, and then they are repurchased. There is a final witness given. Jesus said, you will stand before governors and kings. Don't rehearse beforehand what you are to say. It will be given to you within that hour. You won't have a lawyer with you. You won't need it. They won't know anything about what to say. Huh? So we're not there yet. Well, I mentioned that this person had a second question. He says, how does the seventh head recover if the sword stroke is the monetary collapse and other events that bring about the collapse of the system? Seems that the eighth king springs up in that time. Well, this is another thing. The Watchtower, they have insights into how the prophecies relate to Daniel and Revelation about the wild beasts. And in the 13th chapter of Revelation, there's a seven-headed wild beast depicted, and one of its heads receives a mortal wound. And Jehovah's Witnesses believe that happened in 1914, or during that period, during World War I, supposedly. The Anglo-American dual world power came to an end and came back to life. You know, that's another thing. It's, if people would stop and think, and if they knew a little history, and if they asked the right questions, the Watchtower cites the appalling death toll, especially experienced by the British during the war. The United States was only in the war for about a year and a half, and they quickly tipped the tide in favor of the so-called Allies. And the United States didn't lose that many men, about the same as were killed in Vietnam. The government wasn't destabilized. Come on. It was business as usual shortly after the war. But the Watchtower has to claim that the head was slaughtered back then, because they well know that the chronology has to all mesh, because in the 12th chapter it shows that Satan is thrown down from heaven and he goes off to persecute God's people who have the work of bearing witness to Jesus, and it persecutes them for a time and half a time, which is the same as the 42 months that the recuperated wild beast persecutes the two witnesses. So they have to make that appear to have happened back during World War II. Otherwise, the whole 1914 thing comes unraveled, which it will eventually anyway, but they've got to try to hold it together. It's like the Bible describes it. It's a shabby, whitewashed wall. They plaster coat after coat after coat upon it. But of course, when Christ actually returns, what are they going to do? You better stand clear of the wall because it's coming down, right? But the questioner asks, how will this beast revive? Well, governments have been known to collapse and then be reconstituted. For example, during World War I, the Russian government collapsed. There was the Bolshevik Revolution. The Tsar was overthrown. In fact, he and his family were murdered. And the communist Bolsheviks took over the government, and that was that. They ruled until the early 90s. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. And from that collapse came the Russian Federation. So we can expect something similar. The whole point of this coming collapse, it coincides with Satan's ouster. As I said, the Watchtower knows that. And they've put all this off into the past. That's the delusion. But with Satan's ouster, he is allowed to take down his system that has served as a protection for Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses have thrived in America. They're free to go about their religion, to knock on doors, to stand on corners. When communities try to prevent Jehovah's Witnesses from preaching, they take advantage of the law. It's our God-given right. It's in the Bill of Rights. These are God-given rights. That's what it says. And of course, other nations have emulated that, and Jehovah's Witnesses have enjoyed a great deal of freedom in North and South America and Europe and Japan and South Korea and many other places in Africa. And God has used this system to facilitate the preaching of the good news. So when Satan is thrown down and he goes forth in great anger to get after these who are under obligation to preach and give witness to this kingdom, he brings down the system that protects them and brings it back to life in a different form. What does Revelation say? A two-horned beast came up out of the abyss, and it appeared as a lamb, but began speaking as a dragon. Well, who's the dragon? The 12th chapter of Revelation says it's Satan, the devil. So this system that he will resurrect, I expect it will be a new monetary system, maybe like I've speculated, some sort of cryptocurrency. Will there be a microchip? I don't know. It's technologically possible. But just getting a chip wouldn't be a compromise for anyone. It would require, Satan knows, what God requires of us. Unquestionably, he will outlaw the work that Jehovah's Witnesses do, meeting together, just as has happened in Russia. But he'll require some sort of pledge of allegiance to this resurrected beast under pain of death. If you don't promise to be loyal to this beast, you don't get whatever. You can't buy or sell. So you'll be locked out of the system. I don't know how it'll play out. It doesn't matter at this point. My only hope is to impress upon you that it is coming. The details will take care of themselves. My intent is to counter this delusion that the Watchtower is imposing upon Jehovah's Witnesses. Not that I expect to be successful, but a few minds here and there waking up appears to be spreading, and so, well, let Jehovah do what he does. So anyway, how will the beast come back to life? Well, the way I see it, the struggle is between Satan's empire, his globalist empire, and the nation states. His intent has always been to take down the independent nation states that have enshrined, this Bill of Rights and so forth. That's the iron and the clay. So this coming crash will be a victory for the empire. It will be done with democracy and, the republics and individual nations. We see that struggle going on now in Europe, right? The nations that signed on with this euro has found out that they've signed away their national sovereignty. And that was the whole point. But here we have a backlash of populism, and that's why they're going after Donald Trump. He wants to make America great again, and that's a no-no with the empire, right? And Jehovah's done with it, too. That's why he takes credit or responsibility for its overthrow. For example, in the book of Ezekiel and Isaiah, which I've connected with the takedown of America, where it speaks about Egypt, the anotypical, the anotypical Egypt being cut down like a giant cedar tree. And that's spoken of as taking place during the day of Jehovah. So what is this cedar tree? The Watchtower says it's the whole political system. Well, that can't be, because the giant cedar tree towers over all the lesser trees. So it's the greatest nation on earth, and Jehovah cuts it down. Or he gives Satan permission to cut it down. Whatever. But it accomplishes Jehovah's purpose as well. Egypt accomplished God's purpose long ago. It was a safe haven place for God's people. Even Jesus, as a baby, was taken to Egypt to hide him from Herod's rage. But I think, we're right there on the edge. Even people who don't have any interest in Bible prophecy can see that we're in an era when this whole thing can come down. And I mean, democracy and the United States as a republic can come down, crash. And I believe it will soon. Well, anyway, I'm glad to be back at work. If you have questions, I'll be happy to consider them. You can email me at thewatchmanspost@gmail.com. Subscribe to my channel. That way you'll get notices when I upload a new video. And I thank those who have become my patron. I've set up a Patreon account, and I do appreciate your contributions. I still intend on getting into shortwave, but it's a month or two out at this point. But I hope to expand my radio ministry to real radio, and your patronage will help with that immensely. So thank you for listening, and I hope to speak to you tomorrow. Until then, let's rock.